All right, good afternoon. Woo! It is so wonderful to be together in person in this wonderful place. I'm Elizabeth Henry. I'm the president of the Environmental League of Massachusetts. For those that don't know us, ELM will turn 123 tomorrow. We were founded on June 3rd, 1898, and we feel like it's fitting to be celebrating our birthday here. For 12 decades, more than 5 generations, we have pushed for Massachusetts to lead the nation in environmental policy. We've pushed to create a bright, healthy future for generations to come. And today, we have a once-in-a-generation opportunity to make that vision a reality by passing the American Jobs Plan. Our Massachusetts congressional leaders and local policymakers are all in. They understand that this plan must match the scope and the urgency of the challenges we face. They see that if we are visionary and principled and organized, we can make an uncommonly bright future for our children and our children's children. We can address climate change, create jobs, and advance racial justice all at the same time. Climate, jobs, and justice, that is what this is all about. So we're here today to talk about the American Jobs Plan and what's within our grasp to make possible. $85 billion for public transportation across the nation, $111 billion for clean, safe drinking water for everyone, $200 billion to address the affordable housing crisis, expanded tax credits for clean energy, a historic investment in weatherizing homes and buildings, and so much more. We've invited 3 leaders to contextualize what the American Jobs Plan means for Massachusetts and for individual communities, particularly underserved communities. ELM strongly supports that the American Jobs Plan calls for 40% of investments to be directed to frontline communities and communities of color, communities like East Boston, and we will work hard to ensure that whatever comes out of Congress includes this commitment. I want to acknowledge first Massport for hosting us today, and ELM's national affiliate partner, the League of Conservation Voters. Big thank you to Cindy Lupi from Clean Water Action, Steve Gringus from State Representative Maduro's office, the East Boston chapter of Mothers Out Front, the trustees, and former Massachusetts State Senator Ben Downing. So let's begin. There is no better champion or change agent, no bolder advocate for equity and environmental justice than Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley. She represents the 7th Congressional District in the House. In 2010, she blazed the trail as the first person of color ever to be elected to the Boston City Council. And in 2018, darn if she didn't blaze it again, becoming the first woman of color ever to be elected to Congress from Massachusetts. Today, she serves the most diverse and the most unequal district in our state. So welcome, Congresswoman. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Madam President. And happy birthday to ELM. Next time there should be cake here. But it is a pleasure to be here with all of you, you incredible community builders and leaders right here in East Boston. It is always a good sign because I've been out in the Massachusetts 7th all day today. I started in Chelsea, and so I've been with my siblings in movement building and the work of social and environmental and racial justice, GreenRoots. So it's great to be with them twice in one day, and I think it's safe to assume there is some good trouble being stirred up in the Massachusetts 7th today. But in all seriousness, it is an honor to reunion with my sister in service, Councilor Edwards, and our partners from ELM and GreenRoots to elevate the need to address climate change, create green jobs, and to advance racial justice as Congress crafts a bold, robust infrastructure plan responsive to President Biden's American Jobs Plan and American Families Plan. He's given us the framework. It's now in Congress to legislate. But what is even more encouraging at this moment is the breaking down of our organizing silos across geography and across issue area. We are really finally getting that our destinies are tied. Climate change is an existential threat to our right to breathe clean air, to drink clean water, and to live in clean and safe communities. And we can't talk about climate resiliency without addressing the legacy of structural racism, which has burdened communities of color with far more than their fair share of environmental hazards. It's no coincidence. It is no coincidence that the Massachusetts 7th has been the hardest hit congressional district in this Commonwealth, given the comorbidities of structural racism, giving decades of underinvestment, of divestment, and given the COVID-19 given the heat maps. So it's no coincidence that the COVID-19 heat map of cases per 1,000 residents mirrors a map of environmental justice communities as defined by the Commonwealth. So it should be no coincidence that we are joined this afternoon by activists and organizers from a wide range of issue areas, ranging from gun violence prevention to workers' rights to racial justice, and of course, environmental justice. And that is why we are all here this afternoon, to push the Biden administration and my colleagues in Congress to meet the scale and scope of this moment that we find ourselves in. Americans deserve far more than relief from this budget. And we certainly cannot recover to a pre-COVID, insufficient, unjust, status quo normal. What this moment demands is precise, intentional policies and budgets that will not only set us on a path to a just and equitable recovery, but one that will allow our communities to thrive long after the pandemic is behind us. I'm encouraged by President Biden's framework for an infrastructure plan that includes investments beyond traditional roads and bridges. I remember as a candidate saying, if I'm humbled enough to be elected to represent this district, I'm going to be fighting for an expanded definition of infrastructure to include housing. So it is encouraging, although tragic, that it took a pandemic for us to understand that infrastructure is much more than highways, roads, and bridges. It's about major investments in home and community-based services, which is something that we've been fighting for. It's a disability justice issue. And it's also about a number of encouraging investments in carbon reduction. But we must go farther if we're serious about environmental justice and addressing the climate crisis. The COVID-19 pandemic has made plain that what we need in this moment is a third reconstruction. Again, the president has given us a framework, but it's now up to Congress to legislate, to ensure that this package is robust and is as comprehensive and responsive to the needs of the people as possible. So that means making sure that environmental justice and climate resiliency remain front and center in any discussion about infrastructure. It means directing at least 40% of investment funds to communities like East Boston, Chelsea, Chinatown, all whom are on the front lines of our economic, environmental, and public health crises. It means creating climate jobs programs that specifically benefit Black and brown workers and more. These are bold and responsive policies that must be passed as a single package. I want to underscore that. One package. A single package that meets the scale and scope of the crisis we face, because the climate crisis is one that is impacting our neighbors, especially our most vulnerable. It's not just about the sobering projections that have been forecasted for the future. It's about right now, today. Not in 10 years, not in 20 years, not in 30 years, today. This morning, I was joined with leaders from Chelsea and Everett to elevate a joint proposal for community project funding through Congress's appropriations process, specifically focused on flood mitigation in the Boston Harbor. Every community in the Massachusetts 7th, from Somerville, which I just came from, to Chinatown, and right here in East Boston, are on the front lines of the fight against environmental hazards. It's time for my colleagues in DC to catch up to the leadership here in the Massachusetts 7th. So I thank you all once again for being here today. Thank you for caring about your neighbor. Thank you for caring about our communities. It is my honor to join in partnership with you to be your sister in solidarity as we do the work of making East Boston a safer, healthier, more climate resilient community. And now, I have not had the pleasure of saying this for a very long time. It is so good to be joined by my sister in service, Councilor Edwards, who centers equity and justice in every single fight that she takes on. She was doing that long before she had the title of counselor after her name, but we are just so glad that she has that title, and you are so fortunate to have her fighting for you in the halls of City Hall every single day. So I want to bring to the podium my former colleague, but my forever sister, Councilor Lydia Edwards.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman Pressley. I may be your former colleague, but I'm forever your co-conspirator for justice, forever your co-conspirator. I just want to first of all say welcome to East Boston. On behalf of the incredible delegation that includes Representative Adrian Modero and Senator Joe Boncory, I say welcome to, I am a little biased, yes, but one of the most beautiful communities in Boston. It is beautiful not just because of the green space that we have. It is beautiful because of the fighting spirit and the activism that has helped make this green space possible. I want to tell you a little bit about East Boston, my adopted home. This is the adopted home of generations of immigrants. As a matter of fact, only second to Ellis Island, the amount of new Americans that came to these shores and found their future here. On these waterfronts, they came here to be better, to have more than what they could have dreamed of. We had shipping industries and titans were born here. We still have actually an active shipyard here, industry, on our waterfront. East Boston is the home of so many generations of immigrants, and so many different colors and languages have come here. And every single one of them has taken on the activist spirit to fight for the neighborhood and to make sure that this is a home that they can pass on to the next generations. I always want to give credit where credit is due. We all stand on the shoulders in this beautiful park, but you'll also go down the greenway of the Mary Ellen Welch Greenway, a Maverick Street mother, a generation. Many of them, our great oaks, are no longer here with us, but they were here for us before they even knew who we would be. They never got to see a lot of these parks, but it's those women that we fight for their dream today. So it's to acknowledge that history and to see that the fight continues in East Boston. And it starts locally, but it goes all the way to DC. See us, hear us, know us, fight for us, because we are America. We are dealing with the same issues that every other town is dealing with. We have a housing crisis. We have people out of work. We have new Americans coming in here and caught in an unjust immigration system that needs to be completely overhauled. We have people trying to make it for the first time. We have people who want nothing more than for their children to have more than what they had. That's East Boston. That's the American dream. That's who we are. That's who we beat for, that our hearts beat for. That's in so many different languages that we proudly speak here. So we're calling on DC to see us, hear us, acknowledge us, and honestly, kind of thank us, because we helped make America. We're part of that legacy in so many different ways. I'm so proud to join my sister in service in calling on, not only just for the 40%, but to also direct it to ways that make us more just, that make us a better community, that acknowledge the injustices done also by our government officials. We have no interest in going back to where we were before March 12th, 2020, when the declaration of emergency occurred. We have no interest in that at all. We see the opportunity, our activist hearts are beating, and we know it's time to act. What does that mean? Acknowledge that housing is a human right, period. And you fund rights. You incentivize things that you like, but you fund rights. We need the money for our housing, and we need to make sure that it is seen just like any other infrastructure, no greater and no less. If you cannot house the people, then it's the same as saying you cannot build a bridge to connect communities. because housing is a bridge to opportunities, housing is a bridge to future, and if you don't build it, we won't have them for our next generation. Acknowledge that jobs are part of the green conversation. They're vital to it. We need good union jobs that are helping to revamp and undo some of the infrastructure that needs to be made more green, but we need also good jobs that make sure that we are preparing our next generation of East Boston residents, of Massachusetts residents, to be the stewards of the environment. It should be understood that stewardship and being able to make a good salary go hand in hand. That's what we want to see. We also need to acknowledge at the end of the day that we didn't get here by accident. If we're dealing with inequality, it's because our hands made it unequal. So here we have money, here we have opportunity, here we have will for the first time to say things can't go back. It is therefore our hands that must undo it. We are who we have been waiting for. We have no other excuse. I'm asking for DC to just give us what we need. We'll take care of it from here. I want to thank you so much for this opportunity. Again, welcome to East Boston. Enjoy this beautiful, incredible, diverse community that has adopted me and so many others. It is my heart, it is truly from my heart that I say I love this community. And you will too, because when you love East Boston, you love Massachusetts. You love what we can be. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Edwards. Now, to close out our speaking program, I'd like to welcome Noemi Rodriguez. She's the Waterfront Initiative organizer for GreenRoots. She's a mother, an immigrant, an activist, an organizer, and an advocate for environmental justice, clean air, clean water, and open space for all.
Buenas tardes a todos y todas. Mi nombre es Noemi Rodriguez y soy un organizador con raíces verdes aquí en East Boston. Soy una madre de 3 hijos que se han criado aquí en esta misma comunidad. Soy una inmigrante salvadoreña que llegó a Boston hace 14 años y vivo aquí en East Boston durante 7 años.
Hello, my name is Noemi Rodriguez. I am the East Boston organizer for GreenRoots, a community activist and a mother of 3 sons that I'm raising here in East Boston. I am an immigrant from El Salvador. I have been living in the United States for 14 years, the last 7 years of which have been here in East Boston.
He estado organizando a mis vecinos en contra de la propuesta de Eversol, de una subestación de alto voltaje en nuestra comunidad, cerca del parque donde juegan nuestros niños. Este proyecto es un típico ejemplo de lo que tenemos en nuestra comunidad. Este proyecto es peligroso, presenta riesgo en nuestras vidas, pero no genera beneficios ambientales para nuestros residentes, mucho menos trabajo para las personas que realmente lo necesitan.
I have been organizing my neighbors against Eversource's proposal for a high voltage substation in our community, near the playground where our children play. This project is an example of the kinds of projects we get in our communities. Dangerous projects that introduce risk to our lives but do not environmentally benefit our residents, much less create jobs for people who really need them.
El año pasado, con la pandemia del COVID, he visto vecinos y amigos enfermarse, ir a los hospitales y algunos morir. Ya estábamos lidiando con el aumento de renta y los desplazamientos debido a la gentrificación. Y ahora, después de un año, pocas opciones de trabajo. Todos estamos lidiando con muchas facturas y rentas retrasadas. No necesitamos más injusticias ambientales en nuestra comunidad. Necesitamos buenos trabajos, trabajos que nos permitan pagar nuestras facturas, poder permitirnos que nos quedemos en East Boston y criar a nuestras familias, y trabajos que no contaminen nuestro medio ambiente y poner en riesgo la salud de nuestras familias.
This past year, with the COVID pandemic, I have seen neighbors and friends get sick, going to hospitals, and some die. We were already dealing with increasing rents and displacement due to gentrification, and now, after a year of very little or no work available, we are dealing with many bills and back rent. We do not need more environmental injustices in our community on top of all that. We need good jobs. We need jobs that will allow us to pay our bills, to be able to afford to stay in East Boston and raise our families, and jobs that do not pollute our environment and put our families' health at risk.
Me gustaría agradecer a la congresista Pressley y a las demás personas que nos acompañan por apoyarnos en nuestra lucha aquí en East Boston y por ayudar a traer empleos a nuestras comunidades que serán parte de la solución climática y la solución de justicia ambiental. Gracias.
I would like to thank Congressman Pressley for supporting us in our struggle here in East Boston and for helping to bring jobs to our communities that will be part of the climate solution and the environmental justice solution. Thank you.
Thank you, Noemi and Claudio. And thank you all for joining us as we urge Congress to rise to meet this moment and pass an American jobs plan that centers climate, justice, and jobs. We are now lucky to be able to welcome the Congresswoman back, who will answer a few questions.
So I'm aware that through the ARP there's going to be funding released to cities and towns. I think Boston's in line for around $530 million. Can cities and towns get started on some of this work now before this next bill moves forward?
I'm sorry, ask the question again.
Oh, sorry. It's my understanding that some direct funding is coming to cities and towns now. I think Boston's getting around $530 million. How can cities and towns get started on this work now with those funds? Or, you know, is this how necessary is the next round of funding in order to do the work that you just described?
Well, first, what I think is important, and again, representing the Massachusetts 7th, which is 70% of the city of Boston, Cambridge, Somerville, Randolph, Everett, Chelsea, and Milton. This is a district that is 53% people of color, 40% foreign-born, almost 30% single-headed households. And so this is a district that has disproportionately bore the burden of the pandemic when it comes to coronavirus infections, hospitalizations, and death rates. You know, we fought hard for the Commonwealth to get these funds to ensure that we had both an equitable public health response, that we were guarding against any vaccine redlining to ensure that everyone was equitably accessing the vaccine, that we were supporting our small businesses and our restaurants through PPP and the Restaurant Revitalization Fund, and we fought for that municipal funding. Our colleagues across the aisle never wanted that. In fact, in the initial relief packages, there was $0 allocated to municipalities. So I fought hard for that, being responsive to what I was hearing from the mayors in my district. And then we fought for that the funding that came to the state and municipalities to be discretionary, okay? So that the funding is flexible. Because we know sometimes that the federal funds can come down and it's so rigid in its application that you can't meet people where they are and be responsive to their needs. So we needed the funding to be able to be nimble. And I take the governor and State House leadership, who I've already been in conversation with, at their word that they will honor the commitments that have already been made, specifically for that $100 million. For those 4 hardest hit municipalities in the Commonwealth, 3 of which are in the Massachusetts 7th. So those funds need to be dispersed quickly to ensure that we are on path to a just, robust, and equitable recovery.
And when it comes to that $100 million that you just described, it's my understanding that the governor already has the discretionary $5.3 billion coming that was due to the state, and he has not yet allocated that money to those communities. Does that frustrate you that it's already been 2 weeks and they don't have that money as other states, as other municipalities are already starting to get their disbursements?
Certainly, I believe that those funds should be released immediately. So again, for those communities that have been hardest hit and disproportionately bore the brunt, both of this public health crisis, but also the economic hardship that it has wrought. And again, these were communities that were already struggling. You know, pre-pandemic, very few families even had $400 saved to weather a disruptive life event. So these are families that have already been on the margins, which is why we fought for that direct relief in the form of survival checks, expanded SNAP benefits, extended and expanded unemployment, including the eligibility to ensure that adult dependents and mixed immigration status families could benefit from that, who had previously been excluded in prior packages. And so, you know, what I care about is just those funds being moved and being moved quickly. They've been, I believe, in that account since May 19th, and those funds should be released, and it should happen immediately.
Thank you.
Hi. What in your policy will you be doing to protect residents of Boston who are dealing with environmental racism right now?
Well, I think, you know, these some of the things that I've already done is I've introduced a bill which is gaining good traction in terms of co-sponsorship around lead abatement, removing all of that within our public housing. Also, I do continue to, you know, affirm that housing is a human right and to fight for that both in our recovery to ensure that we are mitigating any of those risks. You know, housing is health. And, you know, a lot of our housing has been subpar, and it has contributed to disparate public health outcomes. So, I mean, I can't set it aside because the work that I do around transit justice and establishing the Future of Transportation Caucus to center equity, accessibility, sustainability, connectivity, that addresses our transportation deserts. The fight that I've been, you know, doing in partnership with Congresswoman McGovern around food insecurity, then that addresses what are many food apartheid systems that persist throughout the Massachusetts 7th. My fighting for you know, housing to be quality housing so that it, because it's as much about social and economic mobility as it is about the public health. All of these things are really, oppression is legislated and it is intersectional. So our legislative response has to be just as intersectional. So, you know, I do have one of the records for introducing more bills than any other member in the 116th freshman class. So I'm serious about legislating because, to Councilor Edwards' point, these inequities and disparities and these racial injustices are not naturally occurring. They didn't just happen. They were legislated and they were precisely created. So we have to be just as prescriptive and just as precise in the path forward. So I would say that those issues relative to environmental justice are at the intersect of my work on racial justice, housing justice, transportation justice, food justice. It's really all, it's all connected.
These funds and your policy rolls out, do you have anything to say about kind of the concerns, especially in the Latinx community here, about the lack of accessibility in terms of language and in terms of just access to people who are who know about their culture and their community here in Boston?
Well, absolutely. I mean, you know, minoritized and marginalized communities continue to suffer because this is something that Councilor Mejia speaks a great deal about on the council right now, is information justice, you know, language justice. But it's not just about translating materials. It's also about, and this is something that we fought for when it came to the pandemic, and my bill, the Equitable Data Collection Act, and then my other advocacy around guarding against any vaccine redlining, was that we are empowering community-based organizations, trusted voices. You know, so that cultural competency is not just about language and translating materials. It's about, as Councilor Edwards said, you know, give us the resources and we know what to do with it. So it's really about empowering and supporting those who have been on the front line, who are the trusted voices. Why do I say the people closest to the pain should be closest to the power, driving and informing the policy making? Because the people closest to the pain not only understand the problem, but they know what the best solutions are. So we just have to listen to them and resource them accordingly so that they can do that work and build up that resiliency. And I don't want us to lose sight of the fact that as we're talking about infrastructure, our most valuable infrastructure is our human infrastructure. It's our people. So the work of environmental justice and you know, mitigation in this climate crisis and all the other things that we're talking about, you know, that's about supporting our people. You know, and at minimum, meeting their most basic needs. People are our most important infrastructure. So things that are threatening their livability, things that are threatening our very life expectancy. I represent a district that in a 3-mile radius from Cambridge to Roxbury, the blackest part of my district, life expectancy drops by 30 years. Highest rates of asthma in the Massachusetts 7th. East Boston, Chelsea, Roxbury, Chinatown. And largely because of proximity to environmental injustices and a legacy of structural racism that has put us in proximity to cause great hurt and great harm. So again, I'm encouraged by the framework offered by President Biden to have a robust definition of infrastructure. I believe that does need to include our care economy. It needs to include you know, elder care, child care. It needs to include paid leave. It needs to include multimodal investments in our infrastructure. It needs to include housing, and it needs to include these investments to prioritize our frontline environmental justice communities. And let me just end here. We keep loosely using the word that we find ourselves in the midst of a reckoning. I grew up in the church. A reckoning is something of epic proportion. So if we are truly in the midst of a reckoning on racial injustice, then our response must be equally commiserate. And the only receipts that matter right now, if we are serious about undoing the harms of the past and charting a different path forward, are budgets and policies. And so now it's up to Congress to legislate.
Congressman, just one more question. On your statement today about the legislature's involvement in the $5.3 billion ARP funds coming to Massachusetts, do you believe that their involvement is going to slow down the allocation of those funds, specifically to those hard-hit communities?
It's still very early in that, you know, in that process. What I care about is the Congresswoman for the Massachusetts 7th, the district that has been the hardest hit by this pandemic, is that those hardest hit communities are getting what they need and getting it quickly. The funds have been there since May 19th. The funds should be released immediately so that we can get on a path to a just, equitable, and robust recovery. That's what I'm focused on. Okay? All right. Thank you, everyone.